Melusine by Lynne Chapter 24, The Question Mark. The twins went back by car with their father the next day. They didn't want to stay any longer. They were missing their friends, and besides... But Roger's holiday, if it can be called that, was extended for several weeks. Melusine was asked at the beginning if she wanted to stay somewhere else, a hotel perhaps, if it was too difficult for her at the chateau. She thought about it for the whole of one day, and that day they didn't see much of her. Roger caught sight of her wandering near the goat pen once, and another time in the sunny distance, down by the river in the willows. He understood she was testing herself, trying to discover what she could stand, what she wanted. In the evening, she came to Roger's mother and told her that she'd rather stay here, that she had need to stay. So that was that. She slept in her own little cell-like room above Roger's, but she ate with them and they kept her company. She had things of her own to do. She continued to take care of the goats. Roger helped her regularly now. She showed him how to sterilize the churns and where to put the full ones to be collected by the factory. They were very heavy, but there was a cart to use. And how to shut the goats up at night. He became quite an expert milker. He even began to wonder if he might like to study farming later on. Then there were the funerals. Both at once, 2 coffins side by side in a church where the smells reminded Roger hideously of the upper room of the tower. The priest went through some Catholic ritual, and if he said anything about the dead man or the dead girl, it was nothing Roger could understand. His mother whispered that was a good thing about the Catholics. They had a trusted formula for everything. Nothing was left to chance. That must be good for the priest when there was nothing to say about a dead person. Melusine sat through the church part, dry-eyed and erect, but afterwards the graveyard as her sister's coffin was carried away. She suddenly bent double as if she had an unbearable pain inside. Roger's mother helped her and comforted her. That evening they could hear her crying upstairs. When Roger climbed the ladder, the window was shut firmly, and the white bedspread was hung behind it like a blind eye. The next morning she came to breakfast as usual, but she cried the next night and the next. It distressed Roger very much. Lying underneath, he couldn't sleep for the sad sounds that came through the hole, but his mother said, "It's good, she ought to cry. I'd be worried if she didn't cry. Tears are like an ointment, they help heal wounds. She's very strong, just leave her." Later she said, "Why don't you move into the twins' room?" But somehow that was out of the question. In the daytime, Melusine helped Roger's mother with housework, much more than the twins ever did, but she wasn't very good at it. She spent a lot of time walking through the deserted rooms of the chateau. Sometimes Roger walked with her. She seemed to be looking for something without really expecting to find it. But she never went into the big old-fashioned kitchen next door, and she avoided the tower. She and Roger talked, or tried to, about the goats, and what would happen to them. They were to be sold. Roger asked if she minded. She shook her head. He asked if she wanted him to tell her what his house in England was like, where she could live, or where she would live. She shook her head. She seemed to be living each moment as it came along, doing what came into her head to do, letting her feelings wash over her like waves. Once she laughed. They were in the dairy working, and there were the usual myriad flies, and she was crouching, washing a churn. Suddenly she glanced up at Roger and put her fingers in her mouth and pulled it long to make a frog face. She snapped at the flies, copying his routine from weeks ago, and he smiled and she laughed aloud. But it was only once. They saw quite a bit of Maître Gérard. He seemed more subdued now, and the tight little smile never appeared. He treated Roger more politely than he had that first day by the car, and one day, at last, he brought news. "We have located the uncle of Mademoiselle. He lives in Quebec. He is married with a Canadian. They have a little boy who is 4 years old." He was translating all this after telling it first to Melusine in French. "What does he say?" Roger's mother asked, "about having Melusine to live with them?" Maître Gérard did his little cough. "He has expressed his willingness, madame. He has write her a letter." And he took an airmail envelope out of his briefcase and handed it to Melusine. She opened it slowly and spread it out on the octagonal table in the big room. When Maitre Gerard came, they always sat in here. It was 3 thin sheets covered with handwriting. She read it slowly, page by page, while the others sat watching her. At last she looked up. It was Roger she looked at first, but he couldn't read her look. Then she spoke to Maitre Gerard. He seemed to let out a held breath and a long sigh. Bon, that is arranged. It will take a little time, and in that time, Mademoiselle Serpais can live with Madame's family in England. N'est-ce pas? Perhaps a few weeks only. Then she will depart for Quebec and her new life. Roger heard his mother let out her breath in her turn. He knew why, or he thought he did. A few weeks wasn't long. The twins would be able to stick to sharing a room for that long without wishing they'd never offered. The next day they set off for home. Roger's father had taken their car, so his mother went to the Niort with Maitre Gerard and hired one. Roger was dead set against this, knowing how his mother drove, but he had nothing to say about it. They were driving to Paris and taking a plane from there. Melusine's luggage consisted of one small battered suitcase. She wouldn't put it in the trunk, but laid it across her knees. Roger sat beside her in the back seat, and as his mother put the nice little Renault into gear and jerked forward across the grass toward the road, he offered up a brief and heartfelt prayer that this whole adventure wouldn't end disastrously in a French ditch. As they jerked past the goat pen, Melusine looked straight ahead, but Roger's head turned as far as it would go. A neighboring farmer who had bought the herd was coming later to collect them. For the moment, they were still there. Melusine and Roger had milked them early this morning and said goodbye to them. At least Roger had. Melusine had not done anything special. No doubt she didn't feel about the goats as he did. To her, they meant work and milk, a living. He looked down at her hands, resting on her suitcase. Soon the tough calluses would go, and the ingrained dirt around the nails. She was no longer an outdoor Cinderella. She was no longer anything she had been till now, except the inner girl, Melusine, who from the first he had wanted as his friend. He thought, when she can speak proper English, we can talk. If she goes to Canada before that, we can write. I can ask her things, and she'll answer, and then I shall really understand. It was a lovely day. The sunflowers were hanging their heavy, seedy faces now, and their petals were browning. The sweet corn had been harvested. The Renault swept smoothly along the good roads, and Roger saw his mother's tense shoulders and hands relax. Maybe she wasn't such a bad driver when his father wasn't around to make her nervous. Suddenly she sat up straight. Look, Roger, your mark. My what? Your question mark, remember? You said you saw it on the way. There's one coming up now. Yes, there it was, painted huge and black on the end wall of a small country farmhouse. Seemed to get larger as it rushed toward them. Stop, Mum, I want to look at it. There was traffic close behind, but his mother turned the wheel sharply and the car swerved off the road. Roger heard her gasp, caught a glimpse of her white face in the driver's mirror, but it was still a full second before he realized the car had gone out of control. He just had time to think of a broken-off thought. But it never happens when you think, and then the car crashed into the huge round spot that finished the question mark. And that's the end of chapter 24.